It's really an honor to be up here after many years of research on this project, pulling it all together and having an opportunity to really address this complex subject with my colleagues from around the world. And of course, Bart Ryan, who is seated right up front, who has been a great co-curator and sparring partner throughout the long gestation and execution of this show. I just wanted to start by acknowledging a few people as we kick into the last chapter of our discussions, at least for the time being on this subject. People on the Walker staff that really helped to make this event possible include Misa Jeffries, Ashley Duffalo, Laurel Jensen, and Amy Dukes in various departments around the institution who were just absolutely critical in realizing the programs and all aspects of the events associated with IPOP, as it's affectionately known internally. I also wanted to just mention that today's opening day events have been sponsored by Aaron and Carol Mack. We're part of the Mack Lecture series as part of opening days. And the Manzuka. Okay, Bart, could you sit a little closer, please, to the front? Gallery in Tokyo has helped us out in funding the opening day talks. And I would also say that any scholarship related to international pop we have to acknowledge the support of the Andy Warhol Foundation. The Warhol Foundation has a grant that is available to curators and scholars as they're developing ideas. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the creation of a forum that helped to seed pop from its early days, and that was we were able to do that because of support from Warhol. So we have a lot to cover today, and I just want to really introduce this subject as I have kind of for the past few days. It's often quite difficult to have an entry point into pop because it is certainly one of the most written about, analyzed, debated moments of post-war art. And it is one that really from its inception has been that way. Henry Geldzahler, who you will probably hear quoted at various turns throughout our conversations today, said early on in the early 60s that he hadn't ever seen any movement become art history as quickly as pop. He said one year, he was looking at work in artist studios around New York and in LA, and really there were no-name young artists. And the next year he was writing about them and seeing their shows mounted in major museums. And so we have really tended to that history of the tremendous scholarship that exists on pop, and been particularly fascinated by the struggles, particularly early on as pop was being formed, about what exactly it was. It had many different names, from common object painting to the New Vulgarians, the generation was called, New Realism. So there was an effort very, very early on, as it was really clear something radical was happening in art in the early 60s, to name it. And one British curator said that pop had sort of become this category that sort of everything was dumped into. And if you look at those early checklists, as we did when we were creating international pop, you can see it was very much more eclectic than we had originally imagined. I mean, we all sort of inherited this version of pop that's defined largely from an American position, and we sort of know what that looks like. It's flat, it's bold, it's colorful, it's sort of direct commentary on mass media, comic books, advertising. And we know the names of those figures, Johns, Lichtenstein, Warhol, Dine. These are names that have been so canonized that they've almost become second nature to our understanding of art from the past 30 to 50 years. And our challenge was to really upend that conception of pop and try to wrangle the subject and the term open again. And that required us to look in some places that had been largely left out of the area of study for many, many years. And so we spent about 5 years, 3 of those deeply, deeply researching this topic. We traveled all over the world. Most of the works in the exhibition were seen firsthand by either me or Bart, or we brought in someone locally to go and work on and study those objects. So it was not an internet curated show. It also is not a global show. I think we had to make and could make this exhibition because we live in a global era. We're able to get around, we're able to do research and exchange dialogues from people across the world. But the 60s was an international decade. It was not, there were not the networks that we know today to exchange information. And that comes out in different moments throughout the exhibition. Information and relationships were disseminated person to person. People learned about art through magazines. Travel was not as extensive, obviously, and as available as it is now. You traveled by car, boat, train. Letters were, a primary method of communication and dialogue. So the internationalism of the topic was very important for us to uphold because it was about relationships between very specific cultural sectors. And in fact, when you walk in the show, you see the clash of two continents in the work of a Japanese artist, Ushio Shinohara, against the backdrop of an artist from Frankfurt called Thomas Byerly. So one of the things that we were considering as we got into this subject were some of the questions about pop. And I'm just going to read those off to you because there are so many questions about pop. I had to sort of narrow it down. And in fact, the whole effort has been a process of winnowing the checklist, the content, the strategy, the method. That was a very important question for us to tackle. So here are some of the thoughts. Could pop exist where abundant post-war commercial culture was not an everyday reality? So we tend to associate pop with post-war affluence and the exchange of goods, and again, fashion, advertising. Were those conditions necessary for pop to flourish? Were there more heterogeneous versions of pop that expanded beyond its association with a highly pictorial style? So as we make our way through some of these slides, you'll see some of it doesn't look exactly like pop, or at least the pop that we've inherited. To what extent do pop forms exist in a localized version? Many artists were very intent on saying that what they were doing was either not American pop or it was pop with a very autonomous, singular position coming out of their particular local reality. And how did the meaning and iconography of pop reflect various realities and power structures at the time? So I just wanted to put this slide up because I think it does capture the array of images that you find when you make your way through the gallery spaces. And we have organized the show in a way that we hope very cogently speaks to the key themes of pop art, and those thematic through line allows us to put artworks together from different global regions that do share a set of ideas or particular preoccupations, and then kind of flanking that main through line, we have these spaces in which you get a deep dive into what was happening in, maybe in Dusseldorf, in Buenos Aires, in Tokyo. So we tried to combine that where pop is international and where it's local in a way that would make sense as you move through the space. There's a little background on how the show got started. It was initially there wasn't a particular interest in doing an international pop exhibition. As anyone who does research knows, that sometimes you start with an idea and you follow it in different directions and it morphs and it takes you onto new paths. But I had a orientation from my own background in photography, and in particular how artists' relationship to photography changed very dramatically in the 1960s. Photography was really considered a very separate discipline from what artists were doing, and yet as various forms of performance art and the Sony Portapak and other sort of technologies enabled artists that were not classically trained in the photographic discipline to pick up the camera and experiment with it, the relationship between photography and painting and other mediums started to expand. And I just threw that image of the Andy Warhol in the lower right-hand corner because obviously Warhol was very engaged in the relationship between the pre-existing screened image and painting. And so that was sort of the initial conception. It was sort of an exploration of a new form, a new relationship to the photographic image. And then that sort of developed into an exploration of the role that happenings and events had also in this changing climate where artists were really trying to figure out what their role was vis-a-vis culture at large. Like artists were leaving their studios and they were taking to the streets, often quite literally, and using the camera to document their events. But art was becoming much more social in the 60s. And again, I'm really speaking in very broad strokes here, but these were the things that were particularly interesting to me, the publicness of art. And of course, pop was very public. Populist, pop, it's a term that it's about the extroversion of art, coming out of abstract expressionism, which was much more introverted, much more of a studio practice, especially in the US, I'm speaking about. So that was another sort of key force in the early investigation of this subject. But then as that sort of started to evolve and the research in happenings and the research in photography, I had to begin to branch out into these different parts of the world to see if what was happening here in the United States was being mirrored elsewhere. And it was and it wasn't. And that really was when the subject of this exhibition, International Pop, was being formed, that there were artists who were definitely interested in image culture and were engaging aspects of, mass dissemination, media, film, but they were doing it from very specific conditions. And I think as you go through the show, you'll see that those conditions are shaped like by politics and by socioeconomic realities. Different artists were coming out of the war in very different circumstances, some, post-war affluence, the economic miracle, and others still sort of living under conditions of austerity. And also they were coming from different art historical traditions. So, when you go through the show, which I hope you have already done, but maybe you haven't, you'll see that pop is really linking, it's very porous, it's linking to Nouveau Realism in Europe, it's linking to Neo-Dada in Japan and also in Europe. It's very much related to this new interest in the figure and the body. Again, after a generation that had been working in a more abstract vein. So suddenly all of these other art histories started opening up. And that's when the topic got really complicated. And I knew that we needed help. And at this point, Bart had joined me in helping to corral the topic, coming at it from a very different position. And we established a forum of curators and colleagues, some of whom you're going to be hearing from today, many of whom contributed to the catalog, to help us sort through the complexities of this subject matter. The show was, we were grappling, as I said earlier, with the method. It was very important for us to have a real strategy about how we did this exhibition. At first, we really just wanted to look at works that had been circulated and had a visible distribution network at their time. In other words, they were participating in something international during the lived moment. But then that method would have eliminated artists that weren't really well known at the time, but were still making really interesting work that engaged pop themes. So out of that forum, we came up with a number of different, Bart made this slide, and it's suddenly gets very graphic and interesting. The methods that we walked away with after that forum were a couple of things. We knew that we couldn't do a huge historical survey of pop. It just wasn't possible. So we decided that we wanted to look at where pop and related pop forms existed with some critical mass, where there were more than one artist who were engaging these topics and themes. So it's not global. We've chosen discrete places where there was an active dialogue around pop and the content that category in itself projected. We also, I mentioned that it wasn't a global show, it was an international show, because the global networks that we know today simply didn't exist. The timeline was roughly late 50s through the early 70s. You know, sometimes we break the rule a little bit, but we felt that we needed to corral the time period a bit. We wanted the heterogeneous quality of some of those early pop shows to come out. And I would say those pop shows pre-1964, it was really in 64 that pop became associated with American artistic production. And finally, we didn't want the show to be chronological, because although chronology helps people move through time, it also creates a, first, then, this, that scenario. And we'd already had that so much in pop art history, where first it started with the British, then it goes to the US. And we really didn't, we wanted to really think about pop as a set of relationships and contingencies and conduits than, a linear path. Is that everything, Bart, in terms of our... Okay. And here you see another diagram of the exhibition and sort of the interlocking facets. So the big circles are ones where we have key themes, and the themes were often inspired by, again, either early shows, articles, important articles. So while the categories do seem loose and broad, they do have sort of a historical anchor in that particular moment. And I should say that we were always going back to this question of what was that moment? We didn't see this as like an art lesson, an art history lesson. We really wanted to capture this incredible energy of this moment where artists were really confronting their reality, their visual reality. They were shifting their roles. They were taking on new roles. And of course, you had feminism, civil rights, a lot of political strife during the 60s, still coming out of the war. So it was a very dynamic time. And so we very much wanted to capture really the effects of a youth generation, a youth culture that was emerging during this period and was behind the energy of pop. One of those sections, and I'm just going to quickly touch on a few of the sections, both the thematic sections and what we're calling sort of the global node sections. So New Realisms is the first gallery that you encounter. New Realisms, of course, is connected with Yves Klein and Pierre Astani, but in France. But we loved the term New Realism because in its more open-ended capacity, artists were dealing with a new visual reality. And this visual reality was one that was being saturated by mass-produced goods and visual imagery coming out of magazines and through reproduction. And again, popular culture was suddenly delivering something that was way more interesting than art history to artists. And they were turning their gaze outward as they were developing their disparate practices. This slide also helps us to maybe foreshadow some of the pathways into pop that you experience when you go into the exhibition, which one pathway may be sort of through the ready-made tradition, the found object tradition, and one pathway may be sort of more through pictorial image culture that was proliferating at the time. And then you have people like Robert Rauschenberg, at the bottom of the slide, who was toggling back and forth between sort of the end of abstraction and the beginning of something very new. You can see the remnants of gestural abstraction in his compositions mixed with found objects. People have often talked about how in Europe pop looked a little scrappier, a little dirtier, a little more beaten up, and American pop was sort of cleaner and more refined and more sealed. And I don't want to react to that, but just to say that part of what we were addressing as we created the exhibition were different conceptions of like what pop was in these different areas. Like, oh, pop was more political in Germany, and oh, it looked more like this in America. And in the end, we had to really challenge some of those positions. Eric is going to talk a bit about the independent group, but I did want to show this slide just because the independent group was very important, based in Britain, and it was a cadre of artists who made shows, mounted slide talks, published articles, and had held seminars. They were connected with the ICA in London, and they weren't just designers, they were and artists, they were architects, they were writers, and they took a very holistic approach to the relationship of art to culture at large. Now, one of the things that I think was very important in terms of what the independent group contributed was Richard Hamilton and Lawrence Alloway, became the first spokesman of pop. Some of the language of pop came out of that moment, some of the theory of pop. Now, people, as I said at the beginning, were writing about pop almost immediately. They were trying to put a language to what was happening. And some of that language still lives. I still love this quote by Richard Hamilton, describing pop, describing what was happening, popular, transient, expendable, low-cost, mass-produced, young, witty, sexy, gimme, glamorous, big business. I mean, he just was throwing in all of these great concepts into these really tight, pithy statements that we've continued to inherit, and other curators and other critics have picked up on that language and challenged it, amplified it, and I guess we're sort of more in the amplification category. But so the British were very important, not just in the work that they produced, but in theorizing a moment as it was in the process of being made. Another section right at the beginning of the show is called The Image Travels, the Archive Shifts. And this is addressing the relationship, again, getting back to, photography and magazine imagery, exploiting simple materials that were becoming widely available. And collage and magazine source material was particularly important to artists that were working in, who didn't have access to, quote, fine art materials, who maybe were working under conditions of austerity or censorship, working in a smaller format. But it seemed very important to start a chapter of the exhibition looking at how artists were experimenting with images and then segueing into someone like Roy Lichtenstein and the way that he was deploying aspects of comic book language into his paintings. Another section towards the back end of the show is called Love and Despair. Again, it's one of our thematic sections. And it is, Love and Despair was a show that was at the Moderna Musette in the early 1960s. Moderna was, was a big importer of U.S. pop. So one of the parts of the study that was really interesting was going to other places on our travels that would enable us both to identify what was happening locally, but then also to see what was happening in America from a, quote, foreign position. So Pontus Hultén in Stockholm and Ileana Sonnabend in Paris and Konrad Lug and others throughout Europe and across the globe were importing pop and contextualizing it within their very particular realities. So anyway, Love and Despair was a show that Pontus Hultén organized that was primarily made up of American pop artists. And it was like a great title, and I really have to respect, exhibition titles because they're so important. But it also tapped into the fact that pop was grappling with sort of sex and consumerism and trauma. And that tension was something that we were very aware of in creating this exhibition. I think this is a really wonderful gallery where you see the body emerge again as a central component of the space, bookending a show that again starts with those images culled from pinups and porn magazines and fashion, and then ending on a note that really has to do with artists, and particularly women artists, reclaiming the representation of the body for themselves. So you see an erotic position or a very gendered composition seen from a very subjective place. As you are concluding the exhibition and segueing into our cinema gallery, which is curated by Ed Halter and is just a fantastic array of films from around the world, you'll pass through an installation of work by an artist named Jana Zalipska, and you see her piece at the top, in the top middle quadrant of that slide. And these are artists that haven't really had any recognition here in the United States. So we're conscious not only of skewing the history in a different direction, but also introducing some new names to that investigation. There is also Bart took the lead on a section of Brazil of the exhibition. We really did extensive research into Latin America and other hubs, and Brazil was under a U.S.-backed military dictatorship and an oppressive political regime, but it nonetheless supported a thriving cultural scene that flowed into music, fashion, and art. The forms that relate to pop in Brazil related to something very particular emerging in connection with tropicalism and concretism. And artists wanted to engage the spirit of these ideas while also reaching into aspects of film and consumer culture. So what was happening in Brazil was very much a hybrid of these different influences that could result in works that merged a strong sensibility towards geometric order with the figure and images derived out of pop culture. It's also an area of the exhibition that's strongly political, and you can see that it's speaking to a time where there was a great deal of turbulence and unrest and vitality because of the U.S. Well, not because of, but aligned with the U.S. presence in Brazil. There's also a piece in the show and in the catalog that speaks to themes of the pop crete, which I think will come out later in our conversations. Again, it's a hybrid between pop art and concretism. Hiroko Ikegami, who is going to be heading a panel later on today, helped us curate a section on Japan. And again, these are little breakout nodes that occur throughout the exhibition. And the Segetsu Art Center was a gathering place, a platform for artists. There really wasn't a gallery system as we know it today in Japan at that time. And these were artists that grew up during a period of the American occupation in Japan. It was, again, a very tumultuous period, but also a thriving and growth period for Japanese artists. When you look at this section of the exhibition, again, you can see threads of sort of surrealism, Neo-Dada. There was no specific cohesive style that can be applied to pop coming out of Tokyo or any other place for this matter. We really, again, we're trying to emphasize the fluidity and the complexity of a term that had very different meanings and associations depending on where in the world you were. Christine Mehring will be talking a little bit about Germany later on, but there was a group in Germany, in Dusseldorf, that is often considered to be kind of the American equivalent of pop, although they strongly resisted that term. There's a great quote in a press release that members of this group, including Sigmar Polke, Gerhard Richter, Konrad Lug, and Manfred Kuttner, wrote, where they said, basically, what is happening here is completely autonomous. Pop is not an American invention. And in fact, when you look at what was happening in Germany, for instance, you can see that the history of fluxus and performance was very very influential in what pop looked like during the post-war period in Germany, which again was associated with this notion of the economic miracle, even though clearly memories of the war still lingered and were very, very fresh. So, identifying those different political realities is part of our work today, and also in the gallery spaces as we are putting things together. A number of people asked us when we were making the exhibition if we were going to be including American pop art. And I can't really see how you could do an exhibition on pop without addressing the Americans. Clearly, there have been many, many exhibitions on American work at other institutions, but we felt that by positioning American artists within a much more international dialogue and framework, that we would be casting a different light on this history that we seem already to know, while also kind of complicating the narrative of pop as being something much more than an American phenomenon. Some of the artists who are included in the exhibition had some resistance to that inclusion, in part because of the association that pop had or has with the U.S. One artist that I interviewed said, once we encountered Warhol, once we encountered what was happening in the U.S., it was like a tank, and it just kind of crushed what we felt we were doing, and we knew we had to react to that. We had to deal with it, and that produced kind of a new iteration of our work. It's also really important to remember that the U.S. was a huge exporter of information, of movies, of pop culture. So even if you weren't dealing with grappling with the artwork that was coming out of America during that period of time, you certainly, as an artist living in other global regions, were confronting American pop culture as it was coming out in TV and advertising and in magazines. So, the U.S. Had to be something of a presence in the show, although we hope not a dominating one. End. I'm getting a little sign. Okay. And I'm at my end. So I just wanted to kind of back up for a minute and state what we really felt about pop in the end. Because I know I've been asked, so what is your definition of pop? Like, if it's so expansive and you're looking at all these different relationships and all these different political and socioeconomic realities, does that completely untether any cohesive brand of pop? And in a way, I hope it does. We see pop as really a full throttle embrace of some of the radical developments that were changing technology, mass communication, and consumer culture around the globe. And we're really thinking of it in relationship to this energy, to this youth movement that was affecting artists who were engaging in many different kinds of practices, even though, of course, on an exhibition gallery wall, you will be seeing a lot of painting and sculpture, but many of these artists were also doing works in performance. They were doing ephemeral pieces. They were working in photography. So the porousness, the expansiveness of this term was really one that we intended to be both our gesture to the scholarship and one that we knew would foster a lot of debate and discussion. So I think with that, I want to bring up and introduce our colleagues from a variety of different positions and backgrounds, and ask them to come to the stage, and they will each be presenting 5 or 6 or 7 minutes on, we've had some debate on this. How can I do this in 5 minutes? On a particular topic related to their area of scholarship. So we have Erica Battle, who is from the Philadelphia Museum of Art and has been a great partner. PMA is taking the show next year. Dávid Fehér, who's Associate Curator of the Museum of Fine Arts in Budapest. Hiroko Ikegami, who's Associate Professor at the Graduate School of Intercultural Studies at Kobe University in Japan, and Christine Mehring, who's Department Chair and Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Chicago. So I hope you can all give them a wonderful, warm welcome, and we will continue our conversation up here.
rotate the monitor a bit lower? We don't see because of the table, but...
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
That's better. That's fine. I think so. I think it's good.
It's good.
Okay. Yes. You ready? Oh, where's the clicker? Do we have a clicker, Misa? Oh, is it up at the? Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. So given the limited time, I will just start. So it's been an honor and a pleasure to work for this exhibition, and I can say more than 100 times thank you to Bert and Darsie for having me and for everybody else at the Walker Art Center. But this journey was a great one, but also a challenging one, because there were hardly any studies on the topic of pop art in Japan. Darsie just said pop art became very quickly, became history in the States, but not in Japan. Actually, I think this exhibition is one of the first attempts to put pop-related works made in Japan in a historical context. So I actually had to kind of invent the term Tokyo pop for this show. That's not really the term artists were using at the time. So it's a little bit misleading if you think, they were considering themselves as pop artists, and they never really claimed we were Tokyo pop. So I just want to get this straight before I begin. But through my research, in my view, I developed this idea that there were two crucial factors for what I call Tokyo pop's development. One is the presence of the United States, both in culture and politics, in post-war Japan. And the other is the country's own graphic tradition in mass culture, which dates back to pre-modern ages. To start with the first, Shinohara Ushio's imitation of Rauschenberg's Coca-Cola plant might look like an example of how Japanese artists embraced American pop without any critical mind. But in fact, pop was understood first and foremost as an American affair in Japan. So Shinohara's imitation was not considered pop at the time. But Shinohara is actually the only artist who claimed himself pop in 1963, and nobody really took it seriously. And he and his fellows were associated with anti-art movement, with their reckless activities seen as undisciplined youth culture. They virtually had no support from collectors or dealers, which was probably the biggest difference from US pop, which enjoyed robust market, especially after 1964. We can therefore see their relationship with America shaded by irony. In Shinohara's case, he actually made 10 copies of his imitation, as if treating Rauschenberg's original as just another piece of commodity. This disturbed Rauschenberg when he found out about it upon his visit to Tokyo in 1964. In this slide, you can see multiple copies of Coca-Cola plant surrounding Rauschenberg on stage when he was making a combined painting. Nobuaki Kojima, who made this figure that has a placard question, he brought in a more socio-political dimension more directly with his standing figure, covered with a cloth that looks like the stars and stripes. The uncanny quality of the blinded figure has been interpreted as the oppressive presence of the United States in post-war Japan, and Jasper Jones, who was stationed in Japan in the early 50s as a young soldier, seems to have understood this implication when he revisited Japan in 1964. I love this picture, by the way. Looks like a James Bond in Tokyo. So, my second point concerns Japan's own graphic arts tradition, which Tokyo pop artists consciously exploited. Japan was a land of pop long before the massive inflow of American popular culture in post-war years. For example, this cloth by Kojima, it looks like the stars and the stripes, but it was actually inspired by a traditional red and white striped curtain used for various celebrations in Japan. In terms of mass culture, the country's print culture had its own iconic motifs, such as Mount Fuji and the rising sun, which permeate Japanese everyday life as the equivalent of American Coca-Cola and the Stars and the Stripes. For instance, Yoko Tadanori, graphic designer famous for his poster with the rising sun motif, incorporated into his animation work, Kiss Kiss Kiss, you can see the work in the gallery, he incorporated a moon motif taken from Hanafuda, a Japanese popular card game. Shinohara also went beyond the originality critique of imitation art when he combined motif of oiran, it's high-class courtesans, of woodblock prints with Pop's mechanical and clear-cut style of production. But it should be remembered that the strong awareness of American presence, along with increasingly Americanized Japanese everyday life, was a far more tricky issue in the 60s than we can imagine today. Many of Tokyo pop artists experienced American air raids as a child, which Tanami Cage had in mind when he made this collage. Then, following the defeat, a quick change of value systems from militarist imperialism to a peace-loving democracy made them suspicious of any kind of ideology, as those who were born in the 1930s are called the generation of distrust in Japan. This political skepticism was most radically demonstrated by Akasegawa Genpei's World at Peace flag, made in 1968. By replacing a red circle on the Japanese flag with the stars and the stripes, he insinuated that post-war Japan was a kind of a vassal state of the United States, and gave a visual form to Pax Americana from a Japanese perspective. And importantly, in this work, Japanese flag becomes one and the same with American flag. It's really inseparable from one another. And I think this aspect is really crucial for the discussion of politicality of Tokyo pop. You can find many other examples in other regions where pop-inspired vocabularies are used to convey anti-American message, like in Latin America. But in Japan, such political message cannot be expressed without addressing the post-war condition of the country, which was a security ally under the military protection of the US government. And I think this factor compares really interestingly to artworks in other regions in this exhibition. I hope this is 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. And first of all, let me say thank you to Darsie and Bart for the invitation on the one hand, and on the other for this wonderful exhibition, which I think is a major contribution for the scholarship concerning pop art. And I will try to add something to the exhibition and this thing I tried in the catalog and now in this short presentation. I will talk about one of the most problematic areas of this whole scholarship, about Eastern Europe, or namely Central Eastern Europe, and mainly my home, Hungary, which is very questionable if we could speak about pop in this area at all. The whole situation is strongly determined by geopolitics and the situation of the Cold War. And I decided to show you some images and go through the material I have and I was working with to give you a sense of this very unfamiliar field of art and art scenes. I will talk about mainly Hungary, but here are some other examples from the region. So the whole situation was strongly determined of the geopolitical situation of the period. These countries, so I'm talking about the countries which are between the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain, had a kind of experience of in-betweenness. They were between two great powers. It's an emblematic depiction of the situation. If you look at the poster of Roman Ciślewicz, a Polish-born graphic designer, moved very early to France and became the artistic director of Opus International. We see a comic-like depiction of two superpowers, and we should address, or we should pose the question, where was Central Eastern Europe in this whole structure? Somewhere between the two guys, but I don't really see any place between the two guys. right to that image, I show you one example of a very late or quite late representation of such pop imagery, which is a very interesting example, and because of the limits I could not include in the catalog. That's a secco of György Kemény, a Hungarian graphic designer, one of the foremost graphic designers of the 60s, who made these wall paintings in a tiny room in a private apartment in the downtown of Budapest, which served as a sort of center for democratic opposition. They went together, had parties, girls, and so on, and these pop-like paintings were on the walls. And if you look at the iconography, we see a new leftist stance, we see Leon Trotsky, we see Angela Davis, Marcel Duchamp, Georg Lukács, and we see we can compare such an imagery with different local versions of pop from Ero until Keiichi Tanami, maybe. But on the other hand, I think it's a very interesting question if we could talk, if we could name that as pop or not. That's an open question, and I don't want to give you a definite answer. If we are talking about the internationalization of pop art and the occurrence of pop imagery in the local scenes, the question of transfer, migration, and circulation is a major problem, as Darsie have already mentioned this. I show you in that slide some examples how pop art and how this information was circulating in the area. There's one example on the left when important artists of the center, British artists Derek Bosch and Joe Tilson, visited the Eastern Bloc and created an event called the Smith-Novak event, which was a sort of emblem, a sort of metaphoric presentation of this transfer phenomena. They sent postcards to London from Prague and invited people from London to send back postcards to Prague. The post is very important for creating network. Darsie has already mentioned that thing also. If you look at the work, or not a work, but a postcard by Robert Indiana, which was sent to Gábor Attalai, that shows that Hungarian artists, and I think other Eastern European artists, tried to build networks through post. They could not travel too much in that period. And the third example is the Fészek Art Club Library, which was a very interesting venue of Budapest at the time. There were a lot of Western art magazines available for the artists, and that was the main source of information. They didn't see most of these pop art works in original, but they saw these black and white reproductions. And if the information and these imageries circulating, we should pose the question, is that pop or is that not pop? And I'm not sure if we can talk about real pop art, hardcore pop art in the real sense of the word. But if you look at some examples from the region, we will see how close similarities could be found between the imagery of these works and mainstream pop art. I just present some examples. I don't have time to talk about them, but if you look at from Willy Wolf from the GDR, which is with these multiplied Lenin depictions, a bit Warhol-like, but also comparable with Thomas Byler or Capitalistic Realism, it would be interesting to compare this imagery with the one in Western Germany and so on, beyond the Iron Curtain. Or if you look at the work of Jerzy Żuraw-Zieliński, The Hot, it's a bit pop-like, but on the other hand, it depicts the self-immolation of Richard Siwiec, so it has a lot to do with the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Just like as the work of Jana Żelipska, the triptych, which also depicts it's very pop-like, but on the other hand, it reflects on a particular historical event, a particular historical problem and political problem. I also want to mention concerning Jana Żelipska that I'm very happy that Lucia Gregorova is with us, who is one of the main scholars of Jana Żelipska. And we could also pose the question, was there female pop in Eastern Europe or not? In the recent period, this sort of questioning was very important. Just to mention the scholarship of Kalliopi Minudaki. And I think we might extend these notions to the examples of Eastern European art. And lastly, Hungary. I will go through the slides of Hungary quite quickly. I think one of the central figures of Hungarian versions or transformations of pop art is László Lochner, who is unfortunately missing from this exhibition, but will be well presented in the catalogue. One of his major works and central works in my essay is Rembrandt Studies from 1966. It's comparable with Robert Rauschenberg or Larry Rivers, if you look at the iconography of the work. But on the other hand, it's completely different. If we read, for example, the inscription, Hol a fény, which means in English, where is the light? It reflects on the one hand a pictorial tradition, but on the other hand, an exact existential situation in Hungary, longing for freedom and longing for light. Pop art like depiction in Hungary was equalized to freedom and a distant light as such. The main event of the artists who were related to pop art was an exhibition in 1968 called the Iparterv exhibition. I present here the cover of the catalogue and the poster for the second Iparterv exhibition in 1969. Both have a lot to do with pop art imagery. And on the other hand, both were designed by György Kemény, a graphic designer who worked in that field, and we could address also the question of the relationship between design, advertisement, posters, and this sort of quasi-pop or pseudo-pop. That's another example from one of the central figures of Hungarian avant-garde, Miklós Erdély, photo mosaics, which were sort of quasi-advertisements of the period and have a lot to do with pop art. This is the Iparterv exhibition. We see the references and the similarities. And if we look at particular works of art from that circle of artists who were partly exhibited at the Iparterv exhibition, partly not exhibited at the Iparterv exhibition, they reflect very peculiar, very interesting historical questions which are relevant for the history and the traumas of Hungary. For example, we see here the work of Sándor Altorjai, Let Me Sink Upwards, which thematizes the Jewishness and the trauma of the Holocaust, just like the work of György Kemény. It's a very personal picture and a very personal story. I will end very soon. I have 2 slides left. And very soon I won't talk about them too much. Maybe in the discussion I will have time to explain the story behind them. But for example, the work of Sándor Altorjai was not possible to be exhibited in that period. That's a work by Gyula Konkoly, who is also a central figure of this pop-like representation in Hungary. This has a lot to do with presenting art history or popping art history, but on the other hand, it reflects also peculiar Hungarian historical questions in Hungary, as he gave the name to the Unknown Man by Titian, György Dózsa, which was a very important historical figure in Hungary and was a commonplace in socialist realism some years before. And if we turn back to my central theme and my central artist in this whole point, László Lochner, his Tondermouth is a very essential, I would say, emblematic example for these sort of quasi-pop. And if you look at that, we can see the differences and also the similarities between the pop art, mainstream pop art, and this very peculiar Hungarian version of pop. If you look at the references, it's not a question how it is related to Jasper Jones or the works of Peter Blake. But on the other hand, if you look at the closed mouth, it refers to the compulsion to remain silent. It refers to the Zen philosophy, and it has also very strong sexuality. And on the other hand, it depicts the mouth of Fritz Teufel, a German revolutionary, which Lochner found in the magazine Stern, 1969. And it has, in that sense, a sort of leftist connotation. And it could be compared with a lot of commonplaces of pop art. And this attitude could be also compared with such artists as Gerhard Richter. So we can see it in a local, in a regional, and also in a global or international context. And it could be also compared with some other examples from the margins. I present in the very last slide 2 examples. One is Jerzy Zieliński's work, which is on the show, and the second is by Kjartan Slettemark, Norwegian-Swedish artist, which also depicts a mouse and criticizes the Vietnam War. So the attitude is very similar to that of my Lochner. And on the other hand, it's very interesting how different marginal places could be compared in such comparative studies. And sorry for being so long. Hope it was informative for you. Thank you for your attention.
So let me also briefly start with a thank you to Darsie and Bart. It's been an incredible honor, but also incredibly moving, I should say, to be part of an exhibition over a very extended period of time, and having started, what was it, 3 years ago or so that we got together. When I have to say, it was absolutely thrilling to be in the room with all these problems, and how the heck was this going to be possible? But also, I walked out thinking, like, this is just not possible. It's impossible. And they pulled it off. It's really, I think it's one of the most fantastic, maybe the most fantastic group show that I've ever seen. And I think it's an incredible model in terms of sort of different kinds of pacings of the show. And maybe we'll get to that a little bit more in our discussion as well. So I'm here to represent the sort of German side, I suppose. And I can't help, of course, but start with one of the foundational moments. You wanted to try to get away from origins. I'm starting with one anyway, which was an exhibition, a demonstrative exhibition that Gerhard Richter and his 3 fellow capitalist realists staged in an abandoned butcher shop in Düsseldorf. And I think the most important aspect of this exhibition is the shopping window installation, where each of them contributed one artwork. And you see Polka standing here in front of the window looking inside. And I'm showing it because it's a foundational moment, but also because it has at its core this idea of a shopping window, which I think is so wonderfully central to the show, with the opening with Thomas Bayer's coat racks, with this Wunderkammer-like window display just around the corner. And the shopping window as a theme really couples with Capitalist Realism, this sort of core German pop group, this idea of thinking very carefully about labeling for the purposes of marketing themselves, the idea of forming a group and building an alliance for strength, and all of that tying together with a shopping window and the shop as a venue for distribution, and something that I think is very important in the German context, and that I realized 3 years ago was very important everywhere outside of the US especially, was this idea of pop as a way for, or as a way in which artists expressed a kind of cultivating and seeking out a market. They wanted a market. They didn't have a market, and they needed a market to sell their art. So the market wasn't this evil thing. It was something that these artists embraced, especially in the presence of a kind of overwhelming presence of American art, and especially US pop art. Next, this is actually a project that I'm working on, have been working on for several years, so I can't help show it either. It's a piece by Wolf Fostel called Concrete Traffic. It was made in January 1970 in Chicago. And I think it's interesting because in some ways it's an example for the sort of use of American icons. I want to continue this theme of Americanism for a moment. American icons and American pop and American consumer culture really were the kind of quintessential core for pop in so many people's eyes, consumer culture, etc. And especially for a young post-war generation that grew up with this in Germany, in my case especially. So this is a 1957 Cadillac covered in 20 tons of concrete, which Fostel made for the MCA in Chicago in 1970 and is now in the University of Chicago collection. And one of the reasons why I think it's important here is because I think it's exemplary in terms of the ambivalence towards the US that is encapsulated here, quite literally. On the one hand, the US embodied mere commodity culture, a kind of hardening, Fostel talks about this with the concrete, a hardening of industrial society embodied in this casting of something, covering of something. But at the same time, it was also the American imaginary. It was something, American cars that every young German wanted to have, and Fostel drove a Cadillac. on the one hand, a kind of desire for American recognition and a recognition on an American market. It was huge for someone like Fostel to be invited to the US, to an American museum in Chicago, and to do a work like this on commission in 1970. But at the same time, in the making of this, having to use local contractors also showed utter unfamiliarity and utter ignorance of the American conditions. He just couldn't gauge at all how this was going to work. So he's actually making a work that is now falling apart because he couldn't understand how concrete had to be made in January in a cold winter in Chicago. Or for that matter, it would have probably been the same here or even worse here. Briefly, he's the most familiar artist that I tend to work on. One of the most famous paintings by Gerhard Richter of his Aunt Marianne from 1965, to address one of the things that I think is central also to German pop, which is the temporality of pop. Versus, so that there's a kind of durational aspect to pop as opposed to a mere presentness. So on the one hand, there's that question that I find fascinating of the dated look of pop that we see so much. So for example, the celebrity photos that Richter based many of his paintings on, not this one, but the one in the show is based on a magazine photo of this woman in this elegant dress going down the staircase. They look very dated now, just by virtue of being black and white, right? But also temporality of pop in the sense of a kind of intertwinement of past and present. This shows a photograph of his aunt who was euthanized by the Nazis, holding baby Gerhard in her hands. And Richter, very classically, of course, mixing sources of private and public, but also sources from the past and sources from the present. So pop really is both at that moment in Germany, and especially in Richter's hands. So there's a connection to the Nazi past through this particular personal history around his aunt, but also because Richter left the GDR and was cut off from his family, including from his mother, who was Marianne's sister, a connection to the very politically charged present in Germany, meaning the divided Germany between East and West. Quickly, Room 19 by Imi Knöbel. Want to mention it only because I think you can see already these sort of very sculptural, almost minimalist installations. This include a lot of cubic elements, which are a little bit in the background. You can't see them. But the boundaries between pop and other movements were very soft in Germany, and I think in many other non-American contexts, which I find fascinating. So someone like Knöbel working with MDF board here, a readily accessible building material that has a lot of connotations in the context of the German Reconstruction, in terms of sort of working in an improvised way, working on a temporary basis. That's all very typical and very resonant historically in Germany in the 50s and 60s. But that, just by virtue of that material, one might say there really is a kind of drawing on popular culture here. But at the same time, the forms that he's creating with it, one might much more associate with minimalism. There just wasn't the kind of critical armature in a lot of these countries, and the kind of canon established as this artwork was being created, as we had in the US with, you know, Clement Greenberg, all those very, very going further than into the 60s as well. Once you had Greenberg in the 40s and 50s, you had something to react against. So that fostered a kind of completely different kind of level of criticism, I think, than we see in other contexts. But you definitely didn't have this canon and these movements emerging so quickly. It's not clear where people actually belong. And then Kuttner, who I'm so happy you included quite a bit in the show, both with his film and with a painting. I think is so important. So he's one of the 4 capitalist realists and probably the least well-known. He dropped out and basically became a graphic designer and stopped making art. But I think he's ready for reappreciation and for rediscovery, and is being rediscovered, I think. I think one of the reasons why he's so important, as is Peter Röhr, who I'll talk about in a second, and I'm closing with these two, is because they're both, like other artists, Thomas Bayerle, very involved with questions surrounding information theory and information processing. And I think that's a central theme, actually, more and more so for me in German pop, that I would love to work on more, and that makes pop and the kind of thematics that it's drawing on very specific to its time. One might very provocatively say that, say, consumer culture, consumer products, mass media, all of that stuff that we associate with pop, that all happened already in the 20s, right? And in some ways, it's a kind of intensification that we see in the 60s. But what actually maybe is truly unique in the 60s in terms of what pop is seizing, and what I think this pop is seizing, is actually drawing on the emerging technology of computer technology and computation, and therefore, and information theory is, of course, closely related to that. And dealing not so much just with the existence of information and media, but precisely with the onslaught and the kind of overwhelmingness and the impossibility to process all of this information in the absence, say, of a computer that is really just in the moment of emerging to become more broadly accessible. So Kuttner really deals, I think, with the limits of perception and comprehensibility, mostly in that film that is in the show, but also in his abstract paintings, where he's constantly creating these sort of pseudo-languages, a lot of noise that he introduces into his patterns, a lot of kinds of interventions that are associated with information theory. Oops. And lastly, Peter Röhr, who was trained as a graphic designer, and I think already this theme of graphic design is beginning to emerge as something that I think is interesting. Also someone who's, because of this graphic design background, is very much reflecting on advertising and information processing and dealing with this information onslaught, and almost dealing with it in a way that actually gets towards the sort of notions of entropy, the sort of excessive information that actually then, once it becomes so excessive, drains information. So he's using the same image over and over again here, and ties it together so seamlessly that it begins to produce false and different information and different kinds of perception. So what actually the unit is begins to break down, and you focus more on the connections, right? And information theory really was beginning to be widespread, especially through a figure in Germany like Max Bense, that a lot of artists were reading. He was teaching at the Design Academy in Ulm and then in Stuttgart, and was quite well known. This ties also into the kind of proto-computational work. So what I'm fascinated with also is the sort of desire for a computer in the absence of one, where I think Bayerle is incredibly important. You know, he's doing all these repetitive motifs that you see on the wallpaper there very early on in the late 60s, and he's doing them by hand because he doesn't have access to a computer. The moment the computer comes, he says, hooray, I don't have to do this anymore, and he's using the computer. And that transition, I think, is really fascinating. So in some sense, you know, we always associate pop with the most advanced technology, but I think it's also interesting that it may actually not have been available there and that they're kind of dreaming about it. Thanks.
Good morning. I also want to start with a thank you to Bart and Darsie for having us here today and for all this amazing celebrations around what it's really turned into an extraordinary exhibition, but also for working so collaboratively over the past few years. And I also had the pleasure of contributing to the show and talking to them about the show since 2012, I think. So I'm going to talk about British pop, and I know we want to, as Christine said, kind of go away from origin stories, but really, if you had to really pinpoint an origin, this would be the founding document. This is a letter from Richard Hamilton to his friends Peter and Alison Smithson, who were architects. The letter dates from January 1957, and it features that kind of stupendous early definition of pop that Darsie mentioned in her introduction. And he uses words that I think actually, ironically, really apply more to a retroactive, concept of pop than to anything that Hamilton or his fellow peers were really doing at the time. Witty, sexy, glamorous, expendable. It's kind of legible up there. But one of the things I really love about this letter is the sentiment right after the definition in which he says, this is just the beginning. And I think it's Hamilton really recognizing that there's a shift and there's a change. And again, this is 1957. The independent group, which I'll talk a little bit about, had been meeting since 1952. And many, many things had happened. But he also says, I'm not yet sure about the sincerity of pop art. And I think sincerity was a big question when pop first began. And as Darsie mentioned, that early panel with Henry Geldzler and many other people were really questioning, what is this this moment about? Is it really about the pictorial? Is there something underneath the surface? Or it really is just a surface movement? Something interesting to kind of think about. The provenance of the term pop art is kind kind of also multi-form, multi-dimensional. Many people credit Lawrence Alloway for coining the term. I think we have to be careful about coinage in general. Alloway uses the term popular arts in a 1958 article, and he's really not talking about art. He's really talking about kind of mass culture. Here, Hamilton's using it in 57, and actually the term pop art first appears in a letter from the Smithsons in November 1956, but really meaning kitsch, not meaning art as we conceive it, of it today. And that kind of spectrum between high and low is something that the British were really interested in, not only just recognizing that there was low culture and high culture, but actually kind of forming a new type of work that was really a hybrid. So that was 1957. 10 years earlier, Eduardo Palazzi made these incredible scrapbooks, some of which are in the exhibition. So this is 1947. I think this is actually the earliest work in the show, if I'm not mistaken. And Palazzi is a great example of this kind of new internationalism. He's the son of Italian immigrants. He grew up in England, and he goes to Paris and gets American magazines. So it's kind of this incredible conflation of culture and a coming together that's really enabled by print media and plane travel and kind of opening himself up to different artists at the time. I had a chance to really look into Palazzi's work, to see exhibitions of his work, and there's some discussion about whether Palazzi really represents the beginning of pop or the end of something else, a kind of late modernist, late surrealist movement. And I think both camps kind of hold water. I think he really the transfer of this material, the physical transfer, the physical act of collecting it and clipping it and putting in these scrapbooks was really quite fundamental to things that would come after. But it also came out of an impulse that I think we can really relate to surrealism and kind of juxtaposition and things he was seeing in Paris at the time. But these are his scrapbooks. These are some pages of scrapbooks. I also want to point out that they're not entirely random. I really found there was kind of a typology at work in the scrapbooks, which was really interesting. There are a lot of pinups, a lot of girls, a lot of women, but a lot of domestic images as well. And celebrity, obviously. And here you're seeing Lucille Ball in Time magazine. This page is actually open in the scrapbook in the exhibition, so you can see it. And on the left-hand side, we have this. Actually, it's a loose piece of paper where he's clipped out of Time magazine an image of Nude descending the staircase, which I couldn't resist showing you, being from Philadelphia. But he's looking at kind of this newly formed domestic sphere. He's also looking at technological progress and as a kind of also a new, let's say, horizon. And I think technology is really quite important for the independent group, which I'll talk about now. And thanks to Christine for mentioning this kind of interesting temporality of pop, which is really quite interesting, especially with the independent group who really were so kind of ahead of their time a little bit in certain ways. So Palazzi makes these scrapbooks starting in 1947. He continues to compile them. He comes back to England in the late 40s. And the first time he shows them publicly is in the ICA at one of these meetings of the independent group, which was a mix of scholars, critics, artists, architects, designers. And they kind of used the ICA, which was itself kind of repositioning itself in London to be a little bit more young and hip and friendly, but it still had a program that featured a lot of abstraction, naturalism, and let's say things were a little bit more old school. But there was a new director, Dorothy Morland, and she really welcomed these young artists into the ICA and allowed them to kind of convene there. And when I was researching the independent group, I was curious, independent of what? It's actually quite funny because it was actually Morland who gave the independent group their name. She just recognized that there was this group that wanted to meet there. They weren't museum staff, essentially, and she just wrote down an independent group in a logbook. But Palazzi shows these scrapbooks in 1952. He uses an overhead projector, and there's a lot of different impressions that come out of that moment, but really it is one of these identifiable moments of seeing new types of imagery and spreading them around. So this slide is showing you one of the independent group projects, which was This Is Tomorrow, which is possibly their most well-known exhibition. And I should say the independent group, they convened, they did lectures, they talked. Oh, I have 1 minute left, oh no. We'll have to get to the 60s in 1 minute. But this is 1956, it actually was at Whitechapel, and you're seeing an image of the one of the kind of almost these mini pavilions that were constructed, and you see Robbie the robot there. There was this incredible kind of exploratory environment that Hamilton and other artists created out of pop culture imagery, art historical posters, a Guinness beer bottle, an oversized beer bottle, but also Marcel Duchamp's roto-reliefs, kind of an incredible moment. And Robbie the robot himself showed up at the opening, and it marks this kind of spread of ideas, which is quite important. I think they got like 1,000 people a day, which is quite impressive. Let me skip to 60s. What I think is interesting about the Brits is that they are recognized as this kind of multi-wave phenomenon. There's an early wave, which was the independent group, and then the 60s, this kind of reemergence of painting and studio practice through really largely London art schools, such as the Royal College and Slade. There are a lot of other artists working outside of schools and outside of London, but just for the sake of time, I'll focus on these artists. Here we have Derek Boshier on the left-hand side, Pauline Bodie at the top, and Peter Blake on the right-hand side. And I chose these images just to show the artists kind of at work, the artists in their studio, the artists touching or somehow treating their work with, let's say, less reverence than might be expected. I love this picture of Derek with all these paintings just strewn about on the ground, and actually the one of the that has the K on the bottom right-hand corner is also in the exhibition. And this is a moment when artists are coming together through these schools, and they're continuing discourse as well. There's a magazine called Arc Magazine, produced by students of the Royal College, and artists are writing about each other's work, and a lot of amazing material comes out of that. And you can see there's a page also about Americana there, which I thought was really, really fun and really interesting. There's a huge response to American work, which is something we'll probably talk about a little bit more in the panel discussion. And as early as 1962, there's a documentary kind of showing these younger artists at work who are really, I would say, breaking rank from their previous generation. And this documentary, Pop Goes the Easel, which I'm sure is going to be shown at some point, maybe as part of this program, really kind of defines the swinging 60s. The artists in their studios, the artists kind of acting in these small vignettes, and the artists literally swinging and dancing, which is really great. And for the sake of time, I'll go to what I would call kind of the third wave. So we have this origin story in London very early. We have this kind of resurgence of the pop scene, the kind of return of the Victorial in the early 60s. And then in the kind of early to mid 60s, a lot of artists start traveling to the United States. So we have Billy Apple here on the top left-hand corner. This is him actually in the American Supermarket Show. Behind him is a work that's in the exhibition. On the top right-hand corner is Richard Hamilton. He's the one with the cigar in his mouth, with Walter Hopps and Marcel Duchamp when he goes to California to see the Duchamp show in Pasadena. And he would make a work in response to that show, which is also in the exhibition, that bears this very big phrase that says, "Slip it to me," very Duchampian double entendre. On the bottom, we have David Hockney and Billy Apple in Coney Island. Hockney, of course, would move to America. This is the trip in the early 60s in which they both dye their hair blonde in response to the Blondes Have More Fun ad campaign. And I threw in the Beatles cover, which is a 1967 cover by Blake and Jan Howarth. And really kind of this almost reversal. We think so much about American culture coming to England, but really this is also the moment of what we would then call the British invasion. So I think the invasion happens, in both sides. And the lower left-hand slide are two artists named Peter Phillips and Gerald Lang, who come to the States and act as salesmen and take a survey from artists critics and curators about what they think the best color, material, and type of work is, and they make an ideal work from that market research. And I think that's also really fun to kind of think about how artists' strategies changed when they came to the United States as well. I'm way over time, sorry about that.
Thanks to all of you guys. It was great. I mean, the time constraint does force us to A, speak really quickly, and B, to try to cram as much as we possibly can into our allotted minutes. And I have just been jotting down notes as you've been speaking because of the texture of what pop was. And I think, Christine, you were talking early on, and I just want to maybe start with a comment that you made, because it was very much part of the ethos of this exhibition, is that what we associate commonly with pop having to do with mass culture and image culture had existed before. I mean, really the first machine age being in the 20s and 30s, and people have often referred to pop as being the second machine age, but that what distinguished pop was distribution, that artists were so self-consciously exploiting the notion of outlets for their work. And I think you beautifully sort of created an imaginary scenario where you hypothesized the future of the computer being sort of a hoped-for reality for Byerly and others. And I just wonder if, as we're aligning pop with this notion of a moment, of a distribution system, what that means in a place like Hungary or Japan, where the outlets and the systems were much more individualized and constrained. I mean, the networks were not as robust as they were in Western Europe and in the United States. So I thought maybe Hiroko or David, you might just begin by speaking to that point or question.
Yes, I think it's a really good point. I agreed with Christine when you said everything was already happened in the 20s, but that wasn't necessarily so in many of Asian countries. So even in post-war, distribution system was just developing. So many of the artists in the Tokyo Pop section, they didn't really see any of American artworks in person. They only saw reproduction of it in art journal, and that was the sort of biggest enough inspiration for them back then. And also, the way their work was distributed was also very, very limited because, as I said, they virtually had no market. And this is where I'd like to talk a little bit about graphic design as well, because graphic designers, they had enough domestic market. And they were artists like Tanami or Yoko, they never had a financial problem. That's why they were actually able to use their spare time in creating their own pop out of work, which didn't get necessarily sold, but that wasn't a problem for them because they were making enough money as a designer. But then they were not really considered a fine artist in art world, which always caused them a kind of anxiety about their identity. So I think the distribution system and how the capitalism worked in a democratic society like Japan, but it wasn't wealthy enough yet, is really interesting question.
David, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting and hard question to talk about such things in relationship to Hungary. There was no consumer society. It's a sort of, I would say, commonplace of the scholarship that in Eastern Europe, and namely in Hungary, there was no consumer society. It's such a distribution as in America or in Great Britain or in Japan it was different, but I think it was much more like that in America than in Hungary. It was not possible, or it was not present. On the other hand, there was, in the second half of the 60s in Hungary, a so-called new economic mechanism, which made a bit a small liberalization of the economics, and that was a change in the society. That was a sort of loosening of the dictatorship, if I say it well, and there were several products in Hungary which were available. Piotr Piotrowski, the Polish art historian, said once, which is, I think, very interesting point, that if he wants to describe what's the main difference between an Eastern European approach to pop art or this popular culture and the Western European, to admit that in Poland at the time, Coca-Cola was much more expensive than vodka, which is not so anymore. And that was the reason why the whole relation to this sort of consumer culture was different. It was a sort of dream for the Hungarian artist, a sort of area of freedom and distant light, as I mentioned. And I want to add another thing. That is the question of advertising and graphic design. I presented several works of György Kemény, and there were other important artists who were graphic designers and also high artists on the same time. And this very ambiguous situation of advertising is also worth mentioning. There were sort of pseudo-advertisements. For example, I could not present here a poster by György Kemény, which advertises not a brand, but advertises an object. For example, umbrella. And it's written, umbrella dresses you up. And that's the advertisement. So there were several ways of thinking, which is similar to advertising structure, but not the same one. And I add a third thing, and that's the last one. In the opening speech by János Tölgyes, who was an intellectual, an influential intellectual of the period, he referred in his opening speech of the Iparter exhibition to Lajos Kassák, a leftist poet and artist, constructivist artist, was very influential at the time and sort of ideal for several artists of the period. And he said that artists do not produce for the luxury market, but for his own friends and relatives. And it says a lot about the attitude of creating art. They were not creating for the art market. On the one hand, it was not existing, or if something was existing, it was centralized and monopolized by the state. But on the other hand, it had something to do with a sort of avant-gardistic way of thinking, not to be commercial. Mm-hmm. And it was a different approach, I think.
I think that your point about the different attitudes and the remark about Coca-Cola, because there were a number of things we were conscious of editing out, and too much Coke was one of them. We had a lot of Coke in the show at one point. But when I was doing research at the Moderne Musette, there was a great article that was about the European reaction to American pop art. And the critic more or less said, a Coke bottle means something completely different in our iconography than it does in the U.S. Coke is so commonplace in the U.S., but it's really special here. So when you blow up a Coke bottle or you radically alter it, it carries a completely different signal. And then I was thinking also, David, about your comment about Lachnar's lips and how we want to associate those lips with someone like Gerhard Richter, but in fact, the better association might be with the notion of silence or some of the source material that the artist used. So I want to just kind of go to the end of the table for a second and maybe, Christine, get some of your thoughts on the idea of the different attitudes and positions that we take up with some of the iconography of pop, because the German artists were very clearly saying that we are not part of the American iconography, we're doing something very different, and maybe what some of those symbols and emblems meant in Germany that we associate with American pop.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things to emphasize maybe is that I suppose certain types of iconography overlap, but that there are particular kinds of images and references that I think just resonate differently. I mean, I really like you emphasizing that, Darsie, that they resonate differently in different contexts, and even within the Western world, when you would think that, Western Europe maybe is not so different from the US at that time. And one particular iconographic cluster that I'm very fascinated with in the context of German pop is that of design and interior design especially. So, I mean, we've talked about graphic design, but interior design in terms of the kinds of objects that people surround themselves with, couches, curtains, pillows, and design objects, lamps, etc. It really shows up as a kind of central theme across different kinds of cities, in Düsseldorf, but also in Frankfurt with Viola, etc. I think that maybe is a good example to sort of enter that context of the discussion.
Erica, do you want to talk about design at all from the standpoint of the independent group? Because design was critical in the context of exhibition design. Again,
Right.
we're talking about outlets and how artists were using and deploying their skills, not just as fine artists, but in the creation of various modes of disseminating their work, including the exhibition space, which I think was such a huge contribution of that group.
Yeah, absolutely. And This Is Tomorrow is the only one I included just in the slides because it's just kind of become the most iconic. But Parallel of Art and Life, Growth and Form, these exhibitions that the independent group were creating were, I would say, a kind of synthesis between or of this almost more cerebral take on kind of thinking about mass culture and a visual experience. And so, for example, in Parallel of Art and Life, it's largely kind of photography based, and you were also talking about the relationship between photography. Growth and Form featured this exhibition design in which kind of scientific experimentation really was presented as exhibition, which actually happened, I think, right after a show at the ICA that was like 100 years of British art. So there's this kind of incredible new mode of thinking about exhibitions as kind of exploratory, but also very informational and a completely different type of design than an exhibition that's your kind of more typical kind of painting exhibitions. They were also, of course, doing graphic design at the time. This Is Tomorrow is a catalog that's become really kind of iconic in that regard. Billy Apple was actually a designer in the design track at the Royal College when he started, but then he kind of wanted to hang out with the cool painters instead. And I think that there's still this kind of like hierarchy of arts that's, that is still applicable in art schools in particular. And so you have the painters who are in the Royal College track, you have Billy Apple who's in the graphic design track, and Pauline Bodie who was essentially dissuaded from applying to the painter's track because she was a woman, ended up actually in stained glass. So you see a lot of her early work is really kind of looking at more geometric forms moving into painting. So there's definitely these multifaceted aspect to the work that they're doing in the independent group, but also afterward.
Well,
Just
please.
one thing in terms of the sort of exhibition venue that I think is interesting with design, and also to come back to the sort of thematics of the shopping window. Something I would love at some point to research and think more about and hear what others have to say about is that, what do the gallery spaces actually look like at the time? I think it's significant that at least in Germany, a lot of galleries are located, not on the ground floor, but upstairs in an apartment building. And they're often in apartment buildings that have survived from the pre-war period. And they're apartments that people used to live in. So, you have stucco and you have small rooms and living rooms, et cetera. And then some of these artists are maybe not quite happy with that kind of removal from the street, et cetera. And therefore also, in addition to it making sense in terms of publicity, seeking out shopping windows and abandoned shops, et cetera. It's becoming more and more common. And, we think today of galleries always being on the ground floor and having a big window and you can basically see the show just looking in, but that wasn't necessarily the case at the time. And I think that that's where really the drive towards having more of a market and the interest in design somehow, for me, come together.
Right. I think that also, in terms of the relationship of the space and the metaphors that artists were using, so you have Oldenburg referring to the store, Warhol referring to the factory, seeing the members of the Capitalist Realists literally putting their work out on a lawn. I mean, there's that great photograph where there's this gorgeous Richter leaning up against a tree. I mean, so the agency that artists were embodying as they were putting their work consciously in a non-art context, conscious engagement of, more of a commercial space, maybe because they wanted to make that link ideologically or conceptually, or maybe just, again, they just wanted to get their work out there. But I think it's an interesting, subtext that runs through the show. I just wanted to quickly talk about the fact that you're all pointing to different ways in which artists were coming at pop, how they were entering pop, be they from positions in graphic design or positions as artists, and the different hierarchies within the sort of fine art, design worlds. And that also, leads to the question of the cannibalization of pop, your discussion, Hiroko, when you were talking about the fact that in Japan, pop was not something to be followed; it was kind of something to be stolen in a way, and that it does sort of speak to the presence of the Americans through the occupation. But I just wanted to introduce that concept of the cannibalizing effects of artists as they were exploring this idea of pop as kind of an import from elsewhere. And I guess any one of you can speak to that if you'd like to.
Okay, let me just.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'd like to make a quick comment about it. I think for what you just called cannibalization effect of pop was actually more effectively done in the field of graphic design again, because in Tokyo, many fine artists were having their sort of pop moment around 1964, 65, 66, when pop was really the sort of a global trend. Everybody was following, pop in many places around the world. But then when that tide sort of, withered towards the end of the 60s, artists, graphic designers started to using pop vocabularies to make a twist and twist it around to convey sort of anti-American message. But then because pop wasn't really the cutting-edge trend anymore in the late 60s or early 90s, again, they were not really, recognized in the art world. So I think you can see many collages by Tanami in the gallery, but none of them was really shown or exhibited when he was actually making it. No gallerist was interested in showing them. So despite this really cannibalizing or critical message, it didn't quite get communicated at the time. I think this is also very interesting too.
I think the kind of cannibalization maybe is not, at least in the German context, not completely specific to pop, but it's really something that happens broadly in the 60s. So, when I try to think of German examples, yes, I think Peter Röhr say the sort of seriality of this repeated image and very much drawing on Warhol, of course, and the sort of serial imagery there, but turning it into something different, because in Warhol you don't have that kind of same sense of beginning to focus on the points of connection, the image breaking down. The image breaks down already just through the process of the silk screen. And he's working on a different scale, and that really creates a totally different impression, I think. So one might say the sort of serial there is kind of cannibalized from American pop. But then I also think, okay, well, Knöbel's Room 19 I showed you, that's a cannibalization in some ways of minimalism, of sort of taking this pop material and drawing on the vocabulary of minimalist sculpture in a way that, yes, while the minimalists also used these industrial materials, they used more high-end industrial materials. They wouldn't use fiberboard like that. And I mean, one could go on. I mean, color field painting, say, Blinky Palermo using found fabrics. There's a kind of
It's a spirit.
irreverence towards what the Americans are doing and turning it. But I think I feel it's not the main thrust of the work. I think that's actually something that I feel we should get away from. Is that yes, that's part of it, and there's a dialogue there, but they're turning it into something that's so different that what that is becomes more important, I think.
Just to add to that, I don't know if I would call it cannibalizing of pop, but there's certainly an equivocal relationship to America and in England, and I think it's important to recognize that, retroactively we recognize American and then perhaps England or British pop as kind of these, stalwarts of the moment, but really Britain post-war was still very much a periphery and looking at America as this kind of superpower that they themselves really were not feeling at the moment. They were still in austerity till the mid-50s. It was a completely different economic landscape in Britain than America, which we're seeing Levittown and the rise of the suburbs and a huge shift. There was a kind of a bleakness in England that I think is important not to forget about. So when you have someone like Derek Boshier who's using the Kellogg's, K in one of his paintings, it's kind of both those things. It's celebratory in the sense that there's an optimism there, but it's also recognizing that English culture is also getting kind of cannibalized itself by American culture. And he said that you wake up to America because you have your Kellogg's and you have your, your cereal. And he paints the Special K logo not in a clear, crisp, what we would call cool, detached American way, but in this very painterly and almost bloody, violent way, which I think is actually, just really interesting kind of spin on it as well.
The show wound up being quite a bit softer than we expected, actually, and that was really striking just walking through the space after everything was finally hung, that it really does push against this notion of pop being sort of an extension of hard edge abstraction or something very severe, that you really feel the visceral contact of the artist with the idea. And some of the paintings like that one, the Special K painting, were so sensual and so soft and delicate in some ways, again, kind of butting up against our assumptions about this so-called pop style, which basically didn't exist. And I think that was one of the efforts that we made with this exhibition, is to push back against any notion that it could exist in a kind of monolithic form.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to add something, because very hard to answer such a question in the context of Hungary, because I don't think that pop art was cannibalized in Hungary. From a Hungarian point of view, pop art was something like an international discourse for these progressive artists. So there was a state-supported scene, and the whole country and the whole art scene was quite in an isolation. And these young artists who didn't experience consumer culture found America or American art and pop art or pop art-like representation as something to as an opportunity to take part in an international discourse, and that was about international discourse. But on the other hand, I can add to that 2 points. One is it was not against pop art, but America was naturally criticized in several cases in that circle. I mentioned several times that this circle of artists were mainly of leftists who criticized America because of the Vietnam War. If we are thinking of a dictatorship, it's easy to think that, okay, there was the Communist Party and then the opposition was not leftist. But it's not true. This circle of artists were also leftist, but thought about the left a very different thing. So, for example, Lochner criticized the Vietnam War very strongly in his pictures. And there is a third thing, which true for Lochner or the work of Konkoly, which I should add, which is a general difference to the silkscreen works of Andy Warhol or Robert Rauschenberg to the Hungarian works of art. That Lochner and Konkoly try to transfer this sort of imagery back to the field of painting, to the tradition of realism, to the tradition of realistic painting. These highly educated artists came from the field of realistic representation, a sort of realism which had something to do with the major experience of socialist realism. That has something to do also, I think, with the career of Gerhard Richter. So that's the reason why I think Gerhard Richter, Zsigmond Polka, who came also from a former Eastern area, had a quite similar attitude to these figures in Hungary. And in some cases, the British pop art was also a very important point of reference, not the American pop, but several versions of pop art.
Christine, I'm sorry to just cut you off, but since you are making those references, do you have any reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like there's a greater sense of the relativity of pop, and some of what you were saying earlier, Darsie, about the sort of some of the dirty look of some of the European pop, I think may have something to do with that as well, that we're actually not quite so far from the East in West Germany. And I think it's really important to recognize too, yes, so Polka came over when he was younger. Richter had been trained in the East. Kuttner had been trained in the East. They actually were in the same place together, even though they don't remember each other. It's really important, I think, that how spatially proximate the East is, and especially in Germany, of course. I mean, Germany is the country that's divided, right? And people know each other across at that point. You know, families were separated, et cetera. So these packages go from west to east, et cetera. So I feel like that's maybe the part that I want to add.
Right. I do want to pause just for a moment because we want to make sure we allow enough time for questions from the audience. And I do think we're going to, at this point, if it's okay with you guys, transfer, to use a word that we've been using a lot today, the conversation out to our guests today to see if there's anything specific that's emerged from our discussions up here that you'd like us to pick up on. And there is two people on either side of the room with mics, so please, this is being recorded, so we want to capture your questions. Yeah, right down here.
Thanks very much for the discussion. Something I was thinking about when you're talking about this is trying to set it in the context of the times, like what it felt like for the people that were sort of spinning this idea of pop, and how it was maybe a kind of an end game, like that. Pop talking about the compression of the high and the low, and the influx of the graphic designers who didn't have, they weren't bringing the weight, you could say, of art history, and they were more engaged in just the moment. And at the same time, something that I don't know if it's addressed at all in the show, but sort of the very strong sort of musical influence that sort of helped to shape some of the pop ideas and back and forth, and the great amount of of pop musicians that came out of art schools in both the United States and England. Sort of just the idea that maybe, in a sense, that art was kind of being left behind for a greater cultural moment that was not specific to art. It was just, it's all coming together into something else, like a giant, I guess at the time, kind of like a youth culture.
Just to add to that, or maybe to modify it a little bit, I wonder, though, to what degree that is, if we take, say, the long art historical view, which I'm usually not prone to take, into account. We have, commissioned art in churches, a Sistine ceiling, and then I think, of course, the 90s started all in the 19th century. We have artists going and doing these alternative exhibition spaces, etc. There's a kind of popular aspect to art making throughout art history, I think. So I would want to kind of ask back or pursue a little bit further what particularly and how might that be different from some of those earlier moments.
Anyone else?
I
Yeah.
definitely think that sorry to
No,
answer the question.
please.
I definitely think that in England it's a youth movement, but at the same time we have to remember that there are multi-generations involved with that movement, and that's not just the 20-year-olds, people like Richard Hamilton who were still really invested and involved in the arts. And I think that it was this moment of a new kind of energy. It's not necessarily entirely new, as Christine was saying, but it's a moment where, this is rock and roll, this is the British invasion, this is the Beatles, and Hamilton makes, a Beatles cover as well, for the White Album. So there's this cross current that I would say is really, really important to this moment. And music and pop culture, in addition to the fine art of pop, if we want to call it that or can call it that, is really essential to, I would say, the transference and transformation and kind of travel of ideas as well. And one of the things I was really struck by when I was looking into all things pop, and I happened to be in England, and they happened to be showing a BBC documentary on the 60s, which is very helpful, very timely. But I saw the segment about Jimi Hendrix coming to London, and within a week of, I think it was Sgt. Pepper being released, he had learned the music and had completely kind of arranged it and performed it in England, and it was just like this mega moment. So this kind of like alacrity with which these exchanges were happening, I think, was really quite new, and this kind of youth movement that's always associated with music. It's not that new to this moment, but it's certainly not. It hasn't stopped. I think that's something to also recognize. But just thinking about all of these things and play together, I think, is really important.
Yeah. I would like to add one thing to the field of Hungary again. There was pop music. For example, Beatles was a very important point of reference for these artists, naturally. But there was also a sort of Hungarian variant of this sort of pop music. So I can mention, for example, the band called Ilés, which played very similar in a very similar style to that of the Beatles, and they were and they had such LP covers as the Beatles. For example, they had a White Album. So it's a very funny thing, and there are several close similarities. If I had chance, I could present you some of the music of them. I think I sent some of them to Bart. It's completely similar. So and I want to add one more thing to the advertising and the graphic design, which I think I forgot to mention. Why was that very important? On the one hand, that was a source of living for the artists, and on the other hand, that was a kind of field area for experimenting. So if you paint a picture in a pop style, they say it is imperialistic, American, I don't know what. We don't want to exhibit such things because it is like America. But if you make a poster in the same style, they say, okay, it's graphic design, there's no problem. So that's the reason why, for example, Lochner painted his works in the style of photorealism or in pop art, and it was, I would not say that it was prohibited to exhibit, but it was not as easy to exhibit as a state-supported artist. But on the other hand, if he created posters for movies or this sort of pseudo advertisements, so not for a brand but for anything else, they said, okay, let them go. And the streets were full of posters of artists like Lochner, Konkoly. So the best Hungarian artists were worked as graphic designers. So that was a golden age of Hungarian poster, and that was even more true for the Polish art scene. I just showed Roman Cislewicz, and there were several other artists. So it's a very interesting situation. And one more thing. That was the same, just one sentence. That was the same thing with textile. That was a construction called textile art. And they said, okay, that's a sort of graphic design, and that's not high art. And if that's not high art, it's not important if it's like American things. It's not. So it was a very interesting situation.
Thank you. Okay. I think I saw a question in the back. Yeah.
Do we have time? It's a long question.
I'll try to splice it into one pithy statement.
Okay. 2 years ago, when Darsie first introduced the exhibition to me, one idea that was really key to it was this idea of realism, and specifically a French Nouveau Réalisme, and then the translation of it in English, or sorry, in America with Sidney Janis. And what interests me here is that, okay, this is not pithy at all. What interests me is that if pop art, the truism of pop art is that the idea of a realism, or the idea of style as a political act, is displaced in the 50s and 60s. What nags at me is that we have the idea of a capitalist realism in Germany, however ironic, and with Akasegawa Genpei a little later in Japan. David, you showed the Georg Kameny with Georg Lukács in it, and even in 56 and 57, we have the Smithsons and Rainer Banham talking about a new brutalist reality, and I'm curious what you all have to say about the strange confluence of realism not necessarily being displaced, but perhaps being a spirit of post-war art.
Do you want to speak, Hiroko, to that from a Tokyo perspective? Okay. Did realism? I mean, we think of realism as being very Western. I mean, and it has very strong associations, not just new realism, but sort of going back to other forms of realism. Was there a parallel there in terms of that idea and the emergence of pop within sort of a new form of realism, a new visual reality?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned it. That. In Japan, actually, in the 50s, there was a genre called reportage painting, and that was really continuing the realist tradition from the pre-war age. It involved leftist painters researching about socially problematic issues like U.S. military presence in Japan or Narita struggle, the struggle of farmers who fought against the evacuation of their land because they wanted to make Narita airport, things like that. So it was really like a realist style, and the subject matter was very much leftist subject. And that was very popular, but then when pop emerged in the 60s, it sort of, blew them away as new realism because post-war Japanese reality was very much inseparable from American mass culture. So that became like a new subject. So I think dealing with the American icons, like by Shinohara or other artists like Kojima, even though they look very cheerful and accepting American dominance, as their own sort of entertainment or enjoyment, that itself was actually a political act to deal with this, new reality, that our reality is now inseparable from American dominance.
Interesting comment. Maybe we'll take 2 more questions. Yep, in the upper left, another upper left-hand corner.
I have a little question about the idea of audience and pop. I was struck last night by how playful the audience was with the works, taking pictures. Maybe it's a contemporary phenomenon. But it also, your conversation brought out this idea of cannibalization across regions and the emergence of a discourse on pop very early on. But I'm wondering when or if pop, when it became popular. When it reached, as Christine was talking about, that audience, that commercial audience or that broader audience. And then I guess a subset of that question is that, are there regions where it never becomes popular? That it's a kind of artistic production that is within the art world, but not necessarily connected to what we would call like pop culture.
Well, I think in terms of the U.S., the popularity of pop was almost instantaneous, which drew a lot of skepticism and a lot of criticism from the serious appraisers of art, the scholars and the critics, and it was considered to be market driven by a movement driven by ambitious young artists who wanted to sell their works, and the works themselves seemed very superficial and sort of catering to a buying audience. So in the U.S., the response in terms of the marketplace and in terms of notions of popularity, I mean, these images were being redistributed through magazines, and the cover of Life magazine, was at one point was, what is this pop phenomenon? So I think in the U.S. it was very quick, but I think it was very different in some of these other global regions. And I'm opening it up to any one of you to answer that question as to how quickly pop became popular.
I think it depends on the region, it depends on which kind of pop. I was actually surprised, Darsie, with the remark that or the quotation from Henry Geldzahler about how quickly pop in the U.S. entered museums, and I actually wonder to what degree that is the case in comparison to how American pop was collected by museums in other countries and how quickly, because to me, there's always been a definite sense that American art, and there's actually people writing about this in the early 70s, say Phyllis Tuchman in Art Forum saying American art is to be seen in Germany. You see more American art in German museums than you see in American museums, and specifically she's referring to pop and minimalism at the time. Now, of course, she could be wrong, but I think this sort of popularity of American pop outside of the U.S. is really important to address in response to that question. And then in comparison, German pop gets collected much later. There's a real lag. All the greatest hits of the kind of most high-selling artists say that this journalist and economist Willy Bongard is publishing in the German economics magazine Kapital in the 70s. Literally from 1 to 100, the most expensive artists. The top is all American, all the way into the early 70s when a few artists begin to penetrate those lists, even like Beuys and Richter.
I think in England, it's quite speedy as well. I mean, if you think about, there's 2 types of accounting for popularity. One is a public response, and one is kind of a little bit more, when did institutions start embracing pop and showing pop in a serious way? trying to think when English pop became its own export. I mean, I think with Hockney coming to the States, you could kind of argue for that. But then again, his work entirely changes. And actually, when I was writing about Hockney, when he moves to California, and we have a great kind of example of his work from his kind of California days in the 60s, you know, how much is that British pop or how much is that more of a reflection of what's happening in the United States? In England, there's a show in 1969 called Pop Art Revisited that kind of pairs English pop and American pop for the first time at the Hayward Gallery, which is kind of, if you think about a very quick response, you know, 69, there's just kind of to have this retrospective look. I think the first traveling show of just pop, English pop, is 76. Actually, it's pretty late. Unless if you want to tell me when the actually here at the Walker there was a show, London, the New Scene, which I think was might have been a little bit earlier than that actually, maybe 75. 65, like much earlier. So in the States, it came here first, but then in wider Europe, this show in 76 was in Hamburg. So it's kind of interesting to kind of trace those trajectories. That Ken Russell film, it's in the early 60s. The galleries are showing the work really rather rapidly. There's an early show, I think in 61 at the AIA Gallery that has Blake and Bodie. It's followed by the Young Contemporary show, which were these kind of showcases for the Royal College. And it just really gained steam from there. And also just to mention that the photos that I showed of the artists kind of at work, I mean, those become really public images. You had Pauline Bodie posing for men's only kind of magazines, and the artist as a figure, you know, as a kind of a social figure. And I think you mentioned that earlier in your introduction, that this was really a social phenomenon as much as an artistic phenomenon, really took over rather quickly.
Maybe one more question? Yeah. Can you just wait for the mic so we can, yeah, there you go.
Thank you for the great talks, but most of you mentioned this kind of anti-American message and feelings that you have in these marginal versions of pop all over from these leftist artists. But at the same time, this desire to have a market in these countries, right? And to be part of this international cosmopolitan discourse. So how much autonomous these movements were in reality? Because they claimed to be, but were they really autonomous from American pop?
I think that was a question for me. And it's hard to answer. First thing is that I'm not sure if we could talk about a movement. It was not a movement. It was a group of artists, a bigger circle of friends. So they were not talking about being autonomous. That was not a question. But there were several discussions afterwards, also in Hungary, how to evaluate this sort of attitude of the artist. Could we talk about this kind of art in terms of following the West? In the one hand, we cannot omit, or we should talk about this thing, that there was a movement in America, there was something in Britain, there was something in Germany which was not known for these artists, and they wanted to take part in discourse. But I want to add two things to that. One is, if I'm in Hungary and I'm looking at these works, they look very pop-like. But when I come to America or go to Western Europe and look at these works again, I feel they are completely different. And I think these artists had great luck because Lackner told me once, okay, you want to make something which is on the one hand similar, but on the one hand different. And if you want to do that, you really want to do that to be similar, it will be at the end completely different, or comes out something completely different. And I think that's the case of these works of art. So, and it's very hard to analyze this kind of art as a so-called closed other. That's a terminus that was used by Slavoj Žižek and Boris Groys and several authors, and naturally Piotr Piotrowski and Igor Zabel, how to describe these countries in Central Eastern Europe, which are on the one hand too close to call them the other. But on the other hand, the artists are thinking in completely different frameworks. And that's the reason why it's the other, but not like India or Japan or something from a European point of view or American point of view. There are several big discussions if we should call this kind of art pop. If we call that pop, we admit that it's a second term. And that's the reason why most of the scholars say that we try to not to call that pop. But on the other hand, it was already called something like pop in the 60s. So it's a big, big dilemma of mine, how to interpret these works of art. But at least if we look at them and we feel the essential qualities of the works of art and the potential in these works of art, I think we will forget such questions of sort of post-colonial discourses and say they are great works of art.
That's right.
And that's my answer, maybe.
Yes, please.
Yes. Well, I'd like to add one more thing to David's comment. I don't really think like any movement is actually autonomous. You know, I think the assumption itself is kind of misleading, and like by saying this is like more pop and autonomous than others, I think we are still sticking to the narrow definition of pop. I think what this exhibition tried to do, and I think successfully has, you know, demonstrated is we just need to loosen up a little bit and then try to, you know, embrace the diversity of, you know, various artists' negotiation with the new reality in post-war world. And it just, I think it's totally natural that it came in a various mode of expression.
You said that way better than I ever could. No, it's exactly right. And when we use the term like pop-like or quasi-pop, to be pop-like is to assume that pop exists as a certain style, that it has a certain set of conditions. And I think that what we are attempting to do with this exhibition is to challenge what pop-like is by simply making pop itself a broader rubric, as it was very, very early on. It was a much more fluid, much more variegated moment that had many different looks and qualities. So thank you all for being with us today, and I'm delighted we had such a great turnout on such a lovely day. And we will be hanging around for a while, just talking amongst ourselves and answering any questions you may want to have as you approach us. So thank you.